everyone, I am Lori with Behavior Education at Spirit Keeper Equine Sanctuary. Welcome to this presentation on behavior-based feeding for snakes. This is not a presentation that when I got into snake training and behavior, I thought would be necessary to do, but I have had so many people ask me, well, how often do you feed this snake or how often do you feed that snake? Become very surprised when I tell them, well, I don't feed them on any set schedule. I feed them randomly. I don't feed them on any routine. I just feed them based on their behavior, the way that they're acting, and a whole lot of other factors. So then it was requested by many viewers that I do some kind of a video or presentation on what I mean by behavior-based feeding and how I determine when the snakes are ready to be fed. So here you go. This is what we're going to do today. Before we discuss what it means to feed based on behavior, let's talk about what it means to feed on a schedule. Many people, this is not unusual at all, feed their snakes like clockwork on a very specific and set schedule and routine. Now, many people feed all kinds of species of animals on a schedule, and there are some species of animals that this benefits. I am not convinced that it benefits snakes to be fed on a schedule because they don't eat on any specific interval schedule when they're out in the wild. Their digestive system is not set up that way. Their digestive system is set up in a way that it gears up when they have eaten a meal, and it digests that meal and it eliminates that meal, and then it kind of shuts down until they come upon another meal and ingest it. So unlike horses, whose digestive system is set up to constantly have food in it, they're grazers and their digestive system is literally set up to have food in it almost 24/7. And so they graze on food and are ingesting food ideally about 20 hours out of the day. Snakes are almost the opposite of that. Their digestive system is set up to have a large prey item or a large amount of food kind of all at once, and then rest and digest and eliminate, and then gear up for another feeding. So here's an example of what it means to feed on a set interval schedule or on a routine. Someone who feeds on this schedule may say, I feed my snake every 4 days, or once a week, or every 10 days, every 2 weeks, once a month. And they may set a specific day of the week or month and a specific time to feed the snake. So for example, we just added 2 snakes to our family, and when I asked when they were last fed, I was told by the breeder we feed every Wednesday. So that tells me that at that facility, Wednesday is their feeding day, and every snake at their facility gets offered food on Wednesdays, and they either eat or they don't eat. So feeding on a schedule is when a meal is offered at a regular interval or at a set time or day of the week or month. There may be exceptions if the snake is experiencing brumation, going through a breeding or shedding cycle. But other than that, it's pretty set. The cycle is set, this is when we feed, and that's when the snake has food available. Oftentimes when people are that set on routine, they will feed the same type of prey every time they feed the snake. That's not necessarily true, but it can be. I have met several breeders who do vary the prey items, even though they feed on a very specific schedule like clockwork. But these would be things that you might want to ask if you're adding a new snake to your family. Just ask what they're being fed, how often they're being fed, if they're fed on a set schedule, or if their routine and the prey type is varied at all. Behavior-based feeding obviously is not done on any set schedule. There's no specific predetermined set interval between feedings. There's no specific day of the week or month or even time of the day that I feed the snakes. Okay, so none of that is predetermined. I vary it. I vary their feeding routine and I vary the type of prey item that they get. So food is offered by me according to the snake's behavior in conjunction with the totality of a whole bunch of other circumstances. So I'm going to go over what those totality of factors are and all of the things that I consider for my snakes when I'm deciding if it's time to feed them or not. Here we go, guys. Here is my big list. Here is my list of the totality of the circumstances, all of the things that I consider before I decide if I'm going to feed a specific snake or not. Obviously, this is based on every individual snake. So yes, we have about 90 snakes here, and I feed each of them individually. Each one does not have a set day of the week or time that they eat, a set interval between feedings. I watch each and every one's individual behavior, and I feed based on that. So let's go through this list. I'll explain some of these things in more detail now, and some of these things will become clearer as I go through some examples. So when determining if it's time to feed or not, I consider the following: the species' natural history. Some species of snakes go long periods of time in the wild without eating a meal, and other species of snakes go very short periods between their meals. So for example, corn snakes, which I have pictured here, eat relatively frequently in the wild. Colubrids in general, like bull snakes, indigo snakes, false water cobras, they can eat sometimes every few days, or they can be snakes that eat weekly or every 10 days. Now, it doesn't mean they can't go longer between meals, because they're not always lucky enough to find a meal in that short period of time, but their metabolism works very, very quickly, and they can eat that frequently. There are other species of snakes that go very long periods of time without eating a meal. So there are some very large species of pythons and boas that might ingest an extremely large meal and go months without eating another one, or they may only eat 2 or 3 times a year. So you have to look at your species' natural history as your starting point in determining about how frequently you think that your snake's going to need to be fed. And then you need to look at the general metabolism and digestive cycle of the specific species that you have, as well as the individual that you have. So the individual health and medical history is very important, because I have known of a few snakes, because of some individual health issues, that need to either go longer than would be normal for their species between meals, or they need to be fed more frequently than would be typical of their species. And so you have to look at that. You need to look at the age of the snake. Baby snakes, juvenile snakes who are growing more quickly than adult snakes are going to need to eat more frequently, because they are growing in size and their metabolism is going to be faster at a younger age. I also look at the activity level and the amount of exercise that each snake has gotten since their last meal. If one of the snakes has not been very active since their last meal, they have not gotten very much exercise, they just haven't been moving around, whether within their habitat or outside of their habitat in an exercise area, then they can definitely go longer between meals, because they aren't burning as many calories, they're not using as much energy, and their metabolism is not going to be sped up at all. If a snake is exercising every day, if they're extremely active within their enclosure, or if they're one of my snakes that comes out and utilizes exercise areas, and they're coming out almost every day or night, and they're really moving around a lot, and they're using their muscles to climb or to burrow, they're burning more calories than their counterpart who's just been sitting for the last 2 weeks. And if the snake is burning more calories, then they're using more energy, and their metabolism is going to be sped up a bit. And so that particular snake might get a meal sooner than the snake that's been sitting and sedentary for a period of time. I also look at the time since the last meal. I do take into account how long it has been since the snake's last meal when I'm looking at all of these other factors in conjunction with that. I also look at the prey type and size of the last meal. If the last meal was huge, they're going to be able to go a longer period of time before they need another one. However, if their last meal was very, very small, they're probably going to need to legitimately eat sooner than if they had eaten a large meal. I look at where they're at in their ecdysis cycle. Did they just shed? Are they right in the middle of shed and they're in blue? Are they about to shed? Because that can have an effect on how much they need to eat and whether or not they need to be fed. Some snakes will not eat if offered food during their shedding cycle, and some snakes will. It can also spur some snakes to shed. So if your snake has gone into an ecdysis cycle and it seems like they've been there forever and they've been in blue and now they're out of blue and they still haven't shed, oftentimes what will happen, if you feed them and they take a meal, they'll shed that night, or they'll shed that same day or the next day. I also look at the reproductive cycle. Even though I don't breed, the snakes are still going through a reproductive cycle. And so you need to look at where they're at in that cycle, because at certain times during the reproductive cycle, they're not going to want to eat. And at other times, they're going to have a bigger appetite than usual because they're gearing up for breeding. Veterinary guidance is also really important. And I say that because if your snake has a specific dietary issue, your vet is going to guide you on how to best feed that snake. That guidance might be meal size, meal frequency, etc., but you just do what your veterinarian says. Time of year and environment is going to make a difference as to how hungry the snake is. Sometimes some of the snakes will go off food during certain seasons of the year. And these are all things that you need to not only know about your specific species, but about your individual snake. I know about every single one of our individual snakes and which ones tend to eat less in the winter, which ones tend to eat more at certain times of the year. I can tell when their appetite is elevated and when their appetite is decreased, and I remember that about each one. That's just how my brain works, but you could also write this information down in a journal. Now, I do write down when the snakes eat and exactly what they ate, and I keep track of weights and body condition, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then, of course, behavior, and I'm going to very specifically talk to you about behavior in the upcoming slides. I'm not here to specifically teach a class on body condition or body condition scoring today, although that could be something that I do in the future. I just want you to be aware that there is a such thing as body condition, and that is different from the animal's weight. The body condition is not just how fat or thin they are, but it's also going to take into account their muscle tone and if there's any muscle mass loss or gain that's unusual. These are just a couple of chart examples that are available online. You can Google these. One is specifically for royal pythons, and it shows you an ideal physique, an overweight physique, and an obese physique. And it shows you what the snake looks like from the top. And then if you were to slice the snake in half and look at it directly down the spine, what the back should look like. This graphic on the right is a sample body condition score of an eastern indigo snake. I've just shown you 3 sample photos here, but number 1 is an emaciated indigo snake, number 2 is one in fair condition, and number 3 is one in normal condition. And I didn't feel the need to show an overweight indigo snake. You can imagine that if number 3 is ideal condition, what overweight would look like. So this is just for your own information and some examples of body condition scoring charts that you can find online. And here are some other resources for you if you're interested in learning more about body condition in general or body condition scoring. You can go to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Nutrition Advisory Group, and they have a PDF online that's available to the public on how they do body condition scoring, and they do include snakes in that manual. This is a paper that you can find body condition scoring in corn snakes and comparison to pre-existing body condition index for snakes. I thought it was interesting to read because it went over in great detail exactly how body condition scores are determined. You can also go to petmed.com, and they have a pretty good general article on how to score body condition in reptiles. Body condition scoring for snakes is typically going to involve, if you want to do a thorough job or you're doing it for an official purpose, like a veterinarian is doing it for physical exam or an investigator is doing it for a potential neglect case or something, these are the things that you are going to look at and measure. You're obviously going to get the body weight, the snout to tail length, as well as the snout to vent length is going to be measured. The circumference around the snake's middle is going to be measured, and then you're going to palpate manually the spine. So you're going to feel along the spine, and between the vertebral spinous and the transverse processes, you're going to feel the ribs and the neck. And what you feel or don't feel is going to determine the body condition score that you come up with, and there's a set system of numbers for what you give each of those areas of the body and how you score them. Let's talk just briefly about your snake's weight and why it's important to know your snake's weight and maintain a good weight history of your snake. This is why I get regular weights on my snake. The vet is going to ask me for a weight history every time I take one of the snakes in. It doesn't matter that they're going to weigh the snake anyway while the snake is at the vet. They're going to ask me, what does the snake weigh? What was its last weight? And what was its weight for a period of time before that? They're going to ask that because any abnormal weight loss or gain can be an indicator of health problems. It can also be an indicator of stress. As an animal trainer and behaviorist, it's really important for me to notice any weight loss or gain because it can indicate chronic stress in an animal, and I definitely need to know if one of my animals is experiencing any kind of chronic stress. And the vet is going to want to know if the animal is experiencing health problems, and abnormal weight loss or gain can be indicators of that. If your snake's weight is inconsistent with their appearance, that can be a huge red flag of a medical issue. If the snake appears very, very thin and emaciated, or appears to be losing muscle mass, but their weight is staying the same or they're gaining weight, red flag. We actually had that happen with Hank, our coastal carpet python. He was maintaining a pretty consistent weight whenever I weighed him, but he looked like he was losing muscle tone, muscle mass. He looked like he was getting thinner. And upon physical examination and follow-up diagnostics, we determined that he had a tumor growing between his stomach and esophagus. So that tumor was growing bigger and bigger and bigger, which was adding weight to him, but the rest of his body was losing weight. It can be a red flag if the animal's weight is inconsistent with the animal's appearance. And then, of course, an underweight or overweight snake can be a cue that it's time for you to change the diet. Either you need to change the type of prey you're feeding, the size of prey you're feeding, or the frequency of prey that you're feeding. Or maybe your snake needs to get more exercise. Or maybe they're getting so much exercise that you need to feed them more calories. So how do you weigh your snake? Well, if you know your own weight, you can just pick your snake up and step on the scale and then calculate the difference. If you have a really, really tiny snake, that's not going to work because the scale won't pick up a minute difference, but if you have a larger snake, that will work. You can also place your snake in a box, a bag, a container of any type that the snake is already comfortable and relaxed in, or on some type of a tray or stand. I often place my semi-arboreal snakes on a perch and put it on the scale. And then just calculate the difference between the empty container that you used and what the weight is when the snake is in it. You can train the snake to voluntarily station and pause on a scale for weighing. We have taught and are in the process of teaching many of our snakes to voluntarily station on a scale for weighing, and that's going extremely well. If the snake is comfortable with handling, they're calm and relaxed with that, then of course you can just pick your snake up and place him or her on the scale and get their weight. We typically get weights as hobbyists in grams, but I can tell you that your vet is going to record the weight in kilograms. Even if it's below 1 kilo, then they're just going to, it's going to be 0 point whatever kilos. Okay, here we go. Here's the fun part. We're going to talk about behavior and behavioral indicators that might mean, yeah, it's probably time for my snake to eat. These are things that I look at, and I can tell you individual behavioral indicators for every single one of our snakes, and when they need to eat, and when they're just doing a behavior but they're not actually hungry or they don't really need to eat. And there is a difference between wanting to eat and needing to eat. And there's definitely a difference between taking advantage of food that happens to come by and really needing to eat. And I feed my snakes when it's really time to eat. Species typical ambush posture is very important. And I say species typical because every species of snake hunts in a different way. And if they're an ambush predator, they're going to get in various ambush postures. I have two royal pythons here. One is a male and one is a female. The male's ambush posture is to hang down from an arboreal spot and coil the front of his body in an S shape and look at the ground. The female's ambush posture is to come near the front of the enclosure and get inside one of her caves and then push the front part of her body out and sit there with her neck coiled in an S shape. Our Morelia Bredli and most of our other Morelia get in an ambush posture that is also semi-arboreal. So they will wrap the back part of their body around a branch, or they'll coil it on a ledge or a shelf, and they'll hang the front part of their body down in an S shape and they'll stare at the floor. The ambush posture for our colubrids is a little bit different, and it's more of an ambush activity. So they will just start moving around more than normal, and they'll start paying more attention to motion, and I'm going to talk about that. So increased activity level related to species typical hunting behavior. What the heck does that mean? You might be thinking, I have a snake that gets into ambush posture every single night. Does that mean they need to eat every night? No. A lot of that behavior is just innate and it's habitual. We have a 3-year-old Morelia Bredli named Salea, and she gets in that ambush position every single night. She coils the back part of her body on one of her highest ledges, and she hangs the front part of her body down in that S shape, and she stares at the floor. But that doesn't mean that she's really super ready to eat every night. It's just a habit. It's a behavior that's innate to the species, and she has gotten a habit of doing that. Now, if you offered her food when she's just in that position, she may or may not take it. And I know that's hard for people to believe, but sometimes the snakes are doing these behaviors out of habit and they aren't necessarily going to take the food. Or they may even take the food out of habit and then drop it and let it go and not eat it. So how I know when she's really ready to eat is she gets in that species typical ambush posture and she's hanging down looking at the floor. And every time I walk by, her head twitches a little bit or her eyes move towards me. And she just makes these really quick, subtle movements in my direction. Now, on other nights when she's actually really not hungry and just doing this behavior out of habit, I could walk by 50 times and she doesn't move or look at me. I can reach in and out and spot clean and change her water and move my hands underneath her, and she just sits there like she's in a trance. I mean, sometimes I think she sleeps that way. But when she's hungry, I can't move a centimeter around her without her eyes moving or her face slightly orienting quickly in my direction. And that is one of the things with her that tells me she's ready to eat and she probably needs to eat. Other behaviors with her, and she's a great example, is instead of her favorite spot to get in ambush position, she'll sit there a while and then she'll sit somewhere else in ambush posture for a while and then in another spot. And then sometimes she'll come to the door and she'll look out more than usual. So it's not just the fact that she's in ambush posture. It's the fact that she's hyper vigilant in that ambush posture, that she has increased movement in that ambush posture. She's staying awake longer in that ambush posture, and she's moving around to different locations in that ambush posture. So it's all of those circumstances combined that tell me, yeah, she's hungry. I'm going to go ahead and feed her. And what happens when I do? She snatches that food quickly and eats it immediately, and there's never any, yeah, I'll take the food and then I'll drop it and maybe I'll eat it later. No, she takes it and she eats it. So let me look at this list again. We went over the species typical ambush posture. Make sure you know what is species typical for the snake that you have. Increased activity level related to species typical hunting behavior. That's what I see a ton in the colubrids. Or I also see increased behavior in species that tend to hide a lot. So the hognose snakes, some of the king snakes, they'll just be out and visible and moving around more. The bull snake, she is very easy to tell when she actually really needs to eat. Now, a bull snake will eat almost all the time, but our bull snake Rodney, when she really is hungry, she comes almost every day and sits at her door and stares out the door because she likes to come out. But when she's really hungry, she not only just sits at the door and stares out, she pushes on the door and she paces the glass and she actively tries to get out of her enclosure. If the snake's awake and active at unusual times, that could be a clue that they're trying to increase their opportunities to find food. So they're staying awake longer or they're waking up earlier and they're moving around more. Our coastal carpet python 005 is a great example of this. If you look at a lot of the videos where I'm training him, I know I've said it more than once. Well, he was awake during the day and at his enclosure door and wanting out. So I thought I'd do a training session because he's probably hungry. That's a clue with 005 that it's time to feed him because he's usually not awake during the day and not wanting out during the day. So for that individual snake, I know if he's doing that, it's probably time to feed him. And then I can look at when did he last eat, what did he last eat, how active has he been every night since then. And the totality of all those factors support the fact that he's probably hungry. Increased attention to and focus on the keeper's routine during care, and then increased reactivity to general movement. These two things are related. So as I said with Saleha, sometimes she'll be in ambush position and I'm doing general care and I'm moving around her like normal and she's just still hanging there and she's not moving or paying attention to me. But if suddenly you're trying to change the water and that snake's coming towards you, or you just go to open the enclosure door or take the lid off the enclosure and the snake is right there ready to come out, well, that might be a clue that they're hungry and they're looking for food. Hypervigilance is when the snake is just paying attention to every single little thing in their environment. And they will dart their eyes around. They will orient towards any slight movement that they see. They will move around more as if patrolling. Hypervigilance is just, I am noticing everything and I am on high alert. That can be a sign that it's truly time to feed your snake. And then any behavior that's rare for your individual snake. And this is why it's so important that you know the body language, the personality and temperament of your individual snake or snakes that you're caring for. You really need to be able to notice any slight behavioral changes. You need to notice their body language, and you need to be able to notice any subtle changes with them whatsoever. If these things are rare for your snake, then it might be feeding related. It might be that they're hungry and it's time to feed them, because I noticed these things with some of my snakes. And those would be just being out of hiding more than usual, awake more than usual or at odd times, moving around more than usual, or changing their ambush spots more often than usual. So maybe usually they get in an ambush position and they stay there all night, but now they're moving around during the night to different ambush spots. If they're seeking freedom from their enclosure and that's not a normal thing, or if they're seeking freedom from their enclosure more than usual. So maybe they only want out once or twice a week, but now 3-4 nights in a row the snakes tried to get out. They've indicated that they want out. Then that's a change in that individual snake's behavior. Climbing, perching, swimming, burrowing. So if they're doing these things more than usual or outside of the normal parameters of when they usually do these activities, can be a sign that they're increasing that behavior, trying to increase opportunities to find prey. I also want to point out that if you have a species that doesn't typically do these behaviors and they're doing one of these behaviors, that could be a clue they're trying to increase their opportunities to find prey, or they're trying to get your attention as the caretaker to let you know, hey, I really need to be fed. An example is our western hognose snake. I guess they're called prairie hognose snakes now. It's the Heterodon nasicus, and we have one. And when she really gets hungry and wants to be fed, she starts climbing. She gets on a perch, she climbs on a branch, she gets up high in her enclosure, and she will actually hang down and look at the door or look at the floor. So that's a clue to me that she probably needs to eat. So any unusual behavior for your species, you know, if they're perching and they normally don't perch, if they're burrowing and they normally don't burrow, it can be an indicator that they are looking for more opportunities to find prey. And then if they're edging more, that's just going around their whole enclosure and pushing their nose on everything, especially the walls, or they're testing the enclosure barriers trying to get out. Now, all of these things can mean other stuff. This doesn't just mean my snake is hungry. If you're noticing any of these things, you want to eliminate a health problem. You want to eliminate an issue with temperatures or humidity or some problem within the enclosure that the animal might be trying to get away from. You want to eliminate things like that. And when everything else is normal and everything else is the way it should be for your snake, and some of these behaviors are happening, it can be related to I'm hungry and food's not coming my way, and so I'm going to actively now do more behaviors to try to increase my opportunities for coming across food. So you really, really need to get to know your individual snakes. And if you do that, if you get to know your snakes very, very well in regard to their behavior, their body language, any subtle changes in those things, then you're going to be able to know intuitively when your snake is hungry, when they might eat, but they don't necessarily need to eat, and when it's really time to go ahead and feed them. This photo on the right is one of my Brazilian rainbow boas, and they hide a lot. She hides a lot. She comes out for a little bit during the night, but not very long at all, sometimes not even for an hour. And she does some moving around and climbing, but she spends a lot of time in her humidity hides, and she spends a lot of time under her substrate. And when she's out in this position, where she is in this semi-arboreal ambush posture, she's telling me, I'm hungry and it's time to feed me. And I'll look at her cage card and I'll see that it's been 2 weeks or 3 weeks since she ate. And I'll look at the size of the last meal, and I will also check that she's eliminated and that she's produced feces and urates, and that that last meal has likely passed through her system, and I'll go ahead and feed her. Now, that was one of the bullet points on the previous slide, was, has your snake produced feces? You know, have they eliminated since their last feeding? And I wanted to talk about this during this slide when we're talking about behavior. So one of the things that you generally look at before you feed is, did they eliminate that last meal? And that's usually a really good indicator that it could be time to feed them again, especially if it's in totality with all of these other factors. But I know that with my own snakes who get tons and tons of exercise, are eating very lean, and are using most of the nutrition they're ingesting, they may not necessarily eliminate between every single meal. It may be a couple of meals before they eliminate any waste. I also know that there are some species of constrictor snakes that eliminate very infrequently. I believe that blood and short-tailed pythons are like this. As an example, they may go a very long time and store up a lot of waste material before they finally eliminate. And then you have the opposite with species like colubrids, Pituophis, the bull snakes, the gopher snakes. They eliminate pretty frequently. Indigo snakes, false water cobras, they're passing that meal through quickly, and they're eliminating sometimes within just a couple of days after they've eaten. I mean, this is variable. And if you want to learn more about snake digestion, there are some scientific papers that are out there in the literature that talk about snake digestion in different species. I know that Joshua Parker did an interview on Morelia Python Radio, and he talked extensively during that interview about snake digestion, how they digest food. So one of the things, bottom line again, get to know your individual snake, their elimination behavior, their feeding behavior, and put all of these factors that we've discussed in a big picture to determine if it's time to feed your snake or not. Now, this little picture here on the left is our Plains hognose snake, Hazel, and she is in the top ledge of her enclosure hanging down, and this was one of the days when I did feed her and she ate no problem. I hear a lot of people say their hognose snakes don't always eat. She does go off food during the winter. I don't even try to feed her unless I'm seeing behavior from her that indicates she's hungry. That's coming out of hiding, coming to the enclosure front and actively pushing on it, asking to come out, and getting in these non-species typical positions, like starting to climb, like starting to lay on the ledge, like hanging down from the ledge and pushing on the door. If she's doing that, yeah, I'm pretty sure that if I offer food, she's going to eat. But because I know that she goes off food for weeks or even a couple of months during the winter, I'm not going to try to find her and get her out and offer her food. I'm not even doing it. She can come out and show me that she needs to eat. All right, here are some snakes showing some motivation to eat. And I wanted to show these pictures because, again, these are species that normally don't do these behaviors every day or every night. The two on the left are Brazilian rainbow boas that normally aren't going to be awake during the day and out in the open like this and in any kind of an ambush posture or actively seeking to come out of their enclosure typically. I'm not saying that you might not have an individual Brazilian rainbow boa that this is normal for. It's not normal for mine. And so when they're behaving in the manner that you see here, it's usually because it's time to feed them. And then the Plains hognose snake on the right, Hazel, climbing over her PVC perch and looking out the door, and she was pushing on the door and just doing a lot of behaviors and a lot of activity that indicated to me, all right, you're probably hungry, and if I feed you, you're going to eat. All right, everyone, this concludes part 1 of our presentation on behavior-based feeding. I hope that you join us for part 2. Part 2 is going to include a quick review. I know none of my presentations are quick because it's in my nature to teach. I promise the review will be quick, and then we will go over some actual videos of snakes who are hungry and exhibiting feeding behavior, and who are not hungry and exhibiting behavior indicating that they're not hungry. And we'll talk a little bit about the video examples that I have. So until next time, please remember to always be kind, love your animals, and don't overfeed your snakes.